A magnitude 4.7 earthquake just tore through Naples, the strongest to hit this part of Italy in 40 years. Trains stopped, a port shut down, a cliff face slid into the sea. But the earthquake is not the strangest part of this story. It struck inside the walls of a volcano the size of a small city, one that hasn't erupted in nearly 500 years. And new research just quietly confirmed something the headlines missed. The ground underneath Naples has been measured stretching toward its breaking point, and two separate teams of scientists can't agree on where it began. Here's what actually happened. At 7:46 in the evening on July 31st, the ground under the Bay of Naples let go. The Italian Geophysics Agency, INGV, logged it as magnitude 4.7, shallow, centered near Pozzuoli. Shallow matters here. A deep earthquake spreads its energy out before it reaches the surface. A shallow one hits like a fist. That's why a quake this size tore rail lines out of service, sealed off the port at Pozzuoli, and sent a section of cliff sliding into the water. More than 20 people were injured. Unoccupied buildings partly collapsed. At least 10 aftershocks followed within hours, the largest a magnitude 3.8 that hit closer to 10 at night, and residents across the bay, as far out as the islands of Procida and Ischia, felt the ground move sharply enough that many chose to sleep outside rather than go back indoors. That's no T overreaction. After a shallow main shock this size, a large aftershock in the following hours is genuinely one of the more likely scenarios, and local authorities knew it. For a few hours, it looked like an ordinary, if unusually strong, Italian earthquake. It wasn't even the first warning sign this year. A year earlier, in June, a magnitude 4.6 quake had already set the previous decades-long record for the region. This one broke that record by less than a full point on the scale, but it broke it again in barely 13 months. Except Italy has plenty of ordinary earthquakes, and this isn't where you'd expect the biggest one in 4 decades. Pozzuoli sits inside Campi Flegrei, a volcanic caldera roughly 13 kilometers wide, half of it hidden under the bay. It last erupted in 1538, a short eruption, about a week long, that built an entire new hill almost overnight. Since then, nothing. 5 centuries of quiet, at least on the surface. So the obvious explanation writes itself. Strong regional seismicity, unlucky shallow depth, nothing more sinister than plate stress finding a weak spot. That explanation isn't wrong, it's just incomplete, and the reason it's incomplete is the detail most coverage skipped entirely. 3 months earlier, in May, a smaller quake struck the same caldera, magnitude 4.4, and it split the scientific community in a way the July quake didn't. INGV placed its depth at 1 figure. A separate group of independent seismologists, working from the same public seismic data, published a shallower estimate, several kilometers off from the official number. Same signal, same instruments feeding the raw data, different depth. INGV's figure ran several kilometers deeper than the independent group's estimate of roughly 2.5 to 3 kilometers down. That earthquake wasn't isolated either. It opened a swarm of a dozen smaller quakes within hours, the kind of clustered sequence that shows up on a seismograph as a jagged staircase rather than one clean spike. That's not a rounding error. Depth is one of the core inputs used to model whether stress is building toward rupture, and right now, the experts measuring this volcano can't fully agree on where the ground is actually moving. That disagreement is where this story stops being a simple earthquake report and starts being an investigation. So let's test the explanation everyone reaches for first, Bradyseism. It's the phenomenon that gives Campi Flegrei its personality. The ground rises and falls like the volcano is slowly breathing, driven by pressurized fluids and gas shifting underground. It's happened before, repeatedly, and it's genuinely well documented. There was a Bradyseismic episode in the early 1950s that lifted the ground about 74 centimeters before it settled back down. Another in the early 1970s pushed the surface up around 1.5 meters. A third in the early 1980s lifted Pozzuoli by nearly 2 meters, cracked buildings, forced evacuations, and then, like the others, it stopped. The ground sank back. No eruption. If you only look at that pattern, the current unrest looks like more of the same. Uncomfortable, disruptive, ultimately survivable. Except the timeline breaks that comfort almost immediately. Every one of those earlier episodes ran its course in 2 to 4 years and then reversed. The current episode began in 2005. It has not reversed. It has not paused. At Rione Terra, the historic district of Pozzuoli that sits at the exact center of the deformation, the ground has now risen more than 1.5 meters in total, roughly the height of a double-decker bus stacked on its end. And unlike the earlier crises, this one just kept climbing through the 2000s and into the 2020s, adding roughly a centimeter a month after month for over 20 years. Stack the total rise from this single ongoing episode against the peak of any one of the 3 earlier crises, and it's already higher. This isn't the volcano doing what it did in 1983 and then calming down. It's doing something that has never been instrumentally recorded at Campi Flegrei before. It's happened before was the reassuring version of the story. It's also, on the actual numbers, not quite true anymore. One honest caveat belongs here before this goes any further. Never instrumentally recorded is doing real work in that sentence. Modern GPS and satellite radar can track ground movement down to millimeters. Nobody had that in the 17th century, or even reliably in the early 20th. So the fair claim isn't that this is the most the ground has ever moved at Campi Flegrei. It's that this is the most it's moved since anyone had the instruments to measure it properly. That distinction doesn't make the current uplift less real. It does mean the phrase unprecedented needs a footnote every time someone uses it. So if this isn't a repeat of the old cycle, what is actually happening underground? One answer came out of Stanford in 2025, and it's almost mundane compared to the headline's steam. Campi Flegrei sits on top of a hydrothermal system, a shallow reservoir of superheated water and gas trapped under pressure by dense rock above it. As that pressure builds, the rock eventually fractures. Trapped fluid flashes instantly into steam, expanding violently in a fraction of a second. That flash is what's generating a lot of the swarm activity, the clusters of small quakes that hit the region in bursts. It's also, researchers believe, behind something residents have been reporting for months. Deep booming sounds felt as much as heard, moving through the ground with no visible source. That's not folklore. That's compressed steam-breaking rock. 2 spots on the surface make that mechanism visible without any instruments at all. Solfatara and Picciarelli, a pair of steaming sulfur-crusted fields just outside Pozzuoli, where the ground has been venting hot gas for centuries. Locals have walked past the bubbling mud pools there for generations. What's changed isn't that they exist. It's that the temperatures and gas output at both sites have been climbing, a visible, smellable signature of a hydrothermal system running hotter and under more pressure than it used to. Elsewhere in the world, hydrothermal systems like this one have occasionally failed suddenly and violently, producing sharp, localized steam explosions with no magma involved at all. That's the immediate physical hazard this mechanism points toward. It's not the same hazard as a lava-producing eruption, and conflating the two is exactly the kind of shortcut that turns a real, survivable local risk into an imagined regional catastrophe. That explains the sound. It doesn't explain why the earthquakes and the uplift are also getting stronger, not just more frequent. For that, a separate, more unsettling piece of research matters more. In 2023, a team from University College London and INGV did something that had never been attempted on a live volcano before. They applied a real-time model of how rock physically fractures under stress, built originally to study material failure in engineering, directly to Campi Flegrei's seismic and deformation data. Their conclusion: sections of the crust beneath the caldera have been stretched close to their mechanical breaking point, not close to erupting. close to cracking. Think of it the way you'd think of bending a metal rod back and forth.